Hello and welcome to another episode of the Science of Adventure podcast filmed from my kitchen. So usually these are filmed in some fun and adventurous outdoor places, but why can't the kitchen be fun and adventurous? The kitchen is a bit of a fitting environment to be filming and recording this podcast, because what we're going to be talking about today is we're going to be talking about race nutrition off the back of my recent race a couple of days ago at the time of recording, which was the Ultra Trail Snowdonia 50k, which ended up being 55k. No, it didn't. It became 58 kilometers. And let me tell you, I felt those last 3 kilometers. Oh my goodness me. I do think that was one of, if not the, in fact, I'm going to lean on the side of the toughest thing I've ever done. The toughest day, the toughest race, the toughest run, and the one thing that I've done that has called on the most of my resilience to do. Now, I have run distances like this before, and I have done mountain races like this before. But the culmination, which is definitely a story for another day, the culmination of the last 12 months has well and truly knocked me for 6. And I really, really needed this race, this event, the completion of just something hard to just really affirm to me a little bit more self-confidence. And there's going to be another podcast on that because I'm still collecting some thoughts as to what I want to put down into words and onto video and onto podcasts for everyone to sort of get into, because I feel like there's a lot to learn from it. And there's an interesting part of a story that we can play here. But today I want to talk about nutrition, because if I can hold my hands up and say this, I nailed my nutrition strategy for this race. I'm going to be talking a lot about Voom products in this. I am not a sponsored Voom athlete. They are very, very kind in the fact that they do support me for a couple of my endeavors, namely the 13 Valleys Ultra that's coming up in September, which is a really, really, really long way. And they are gracious enough to support me with a few products between here and then. But this is not a sponsored podcast, not a sponsored episode. I'm going to be saying stuff about Voom. I'm going to be saying stuff about other companies. This is me trying to give you a evidence-based, balanced, non-biased approach to race nutrition. I'm going to be quite critical of some areas of race nutrition, and I'm going to be a little bit more open and nebula, because the beautiful thing about nutrition is nobody knows everything, and that's the beautiful thing, because that means you can adapt the principles to make your own methods and kind of make things a little bit more uniquely your own, because what works for me might not work for you, won't work for anyone else. It's about understanding the principles, applying your own methods, and then finding the way that works for you. Now, before we talk about the actual race day, let's talk about this whole carbohydrate loading thing first. Now, lots of people like to talk about carb loading, and I think they like to talk about it, hashtag carb loading on social media, while justifying the massive plate of pasta or pizza or whatever it is that they're eating pre-race, usually the night before. I'm going to tell you now, a massive meal the night before a race or an event is a bad idea. Why? Because it doesn't matter if it's all carbohydrates or not, you've still got to digest it. And if you think that it takes 24 to 48 hours to get from here out the other end, then you need to ensure that you're allowing for that time period between your carbohydrate loading window and the start of your race. Because the last thing you want, let me tell you, because I've been on the wrong side of this, the last thing you want is to need to go to the toilet midway around a race. And if it's a race that doesn't have toilet stops or toilets at checkpoints, you're going in the bushes, and if you've got really sore legs, it's tough to get back up again. So we need to make sure we get this right. So let's look at the science, the evidence around carbohydrate loading. We're going to use that as our method, as our principles, and then we're going to eke out a few methods that work for me, and I'm going to suggest a few things that might work for you, and I want you to go off and try it. The key thing about trying anything race nutrition-wise is you never, ever, ever try anything new on race day, because it's just not going to happen. You go and look, if you're into Formula One and you watch a Formula One team, they're never going to try a new fuel or a new thing on their car when it comes to the Grand Prix weekend. That's never going to happen. So don't do the same for you on race day. There are companies out there that will market themselves as you don't need to have practiced this before race day. You can take this on race day without having tried it before. Don't do it. Don't do it, because you don't know how you're going to react to it. You don't know how your digestive system is going to react to it. You don't know how you're going to feel after it in terms of energy levels. You've got to use your long training sessions, your long runs, your long bikes, your long hikes as a way of practicing and drilling your digestive system as much as your body and your stamina. Now then, when it comes to the evidence of carbohydrate loading, we need to be stretching that timeline 72-ish hours between race start time and this date in which you start carbohydrate loading. So we need to cover 72 hours. And if we look at the research, we need to be looking at somewhere between 8 and 10 grams of carbohydrate per kilo body weight. So for really easy maths, if you weigh 80 kilos like me, and I times that by 10, that's an additional 800 grams of carbohydrates over those 3 days. If we take that 800 and we divide it by 3 and we get roughly, let's say 250 for ease of quick maths, if we say it's roughly 250, that's an additional 250 grams of carbohydrates in your daily diet on top of what you're normally eating. How that tends to look is an additional portion of carbohydrates or cereal, which you'll hear me talk about in a minute, on top of each meal. We don't need to go hell for leather. And carbohydrates are in many forms. When you come to looking at the sharp end of the runner's diet, i.e. this week, this golden week, if we call it that, leading up to the event and the event itself, the healthy human diet has gone. It's gone out the window. It's on hold for a week. Because when we are looking at race nutrition, we are looking at simple carbohydrates, sugars, added sugars, sugary sports drinks. All these things are really going to help us ensure that we are prepared and ready to go. Now, for that, in that 3-day window, I mentioned cereal. Literally, I had a 500-gram box of Crunchy Nut, which ends up coming at around 400 grams of carbohydrates. I smashed the whole box in 3 days. No problem at all, because that's, a portion of my size. It's probably 6 or 7 bowls of cereal, something like that, over 3 days, good to go. An additional 400 grams. On top of that, sugary Lucozade sports drinks really, really work well. Pick a mix, Jelly Babies, sweets work really, really well. Measure them out. Don't just go hell for leather. Measure them out and then split them down over your normal pattern of meals in that 3 days. And I mentioned about doing your long training as trials for this. If you're doing 6 months of training, between month 1 and month 6 when the event is, at some point, you're going to have some key long training sessions. And those key long training sessions are going to be treated like a race day. So in those key long training sessions, you don't need to do this every single week. But let's say in that 6 months' time, you're doing 3 of these key sort of practice events. Use them to practice your race week nutrition, this carbohydrate loading window. Because not only are we increasing our carbohydrates by up to 10 grams per kilo body weight, but we are also looking to reduce fiber. It's a little bit more difficult to do this if you're on a plant-based or a vegetarian diet, but you're reducing fiber. That is the beans, legumes, the nuts, the seeds, the things that are obviously going to help you go to the toilet more, and your green cruciferous vegetables, like the roughages, if you like, you're reducing those down. Because what fiber does is it slows down digestive transit and means that food takes longer to go from here down the other end. Whereas, because the carbohydrates that are found in fiber aren't necessarily stored as glycogen in the muscles, we need to kind of replace them with more simple carbohydrates. Now, yes, absolutely, potatoes, rice, even sweet potatoes, things like this can definitely feed. I have a lot of oats in my carbohydrate bulking and loading window because these really work very, very well. But we are reducing down the fiber. So we're not going for like a poke bowl the night before because there's a lot of fiber in that. There's a lot of roughages, there's a lot of raw vegetables, that sort of thing. That's going to slow down our digestive transit, meaning that food's going to stay here for longer. And the last thing you want when we come to the Friday, let's say your event's on Saturday, we come to the Friday, is a high fiber diet or a high protein diet or something that's going to sit here quite for a long time, and then you go to bed and lay down. We are gravitationally fed beings. So if it comes to food and it's sat here in your stomach and gravity is not helping you by feeding it down south to the other end, then you're going to wake up in the morning still full. And you'll have an example of that at some point in your life because you've probably had a Friday night Chinese takeaway or a curry or a massive meal or a late night Nando's, whatever it is, and you've gone to bed and you've woken up and you'd be like, I'm still a little bit full. I can still taste garlic. We've all been there, and that's what happens. In this carbohydrate loading window, from if our event is on Saturday, from Wednesday to Friday night, up to 10 grams per kilo body weight, somewhere between 8 and 10 grams, so you've got a range to play with, per kilo body weight of carbohydrates additional to your daily diet is where you're looking. A reduction of fiber is very, very important, and an increase in hydration. I'll bang the hydration drum until the cows come home, and I'll always say drink 2 to 3 litres of water per day. But from Wednesday to Friday, if your event's on Saturday, you want 3 litres of fluid per day. And you want to make a litre of that minimum, a minimum of a litre of that as electrolytes. So if you're using, Voom hydration, or if you're using like High Five Zeros, I've always got a pack of those tablets somewhere. Whatever your electrolyte solution is, of those 3 litres, get a litre of it as electrolytes. Because you can overhydrate with water. You're not necessarily going to do it in 3 litres. But if you want to have adequate and optimal hydration, increasing your electrolyte content, especially like I had last Saturday for a very, very hot race where it's super sunny and you're sweating buckets, then having those electrolytes on board is super, super important. So that pretty much covers the Wednesday to Friday. Well, what about the Saturday morning? Well, if you're getting up and you're going for race day, this is where you have already practiced in pretty much every single one of your long training sessions what your pre-race, your pre-long training session breakfast is, and have the same thing every time. For me, it's porridge with dates, because I think dates are like absolute rocket fuel. Maple syrup, I've got like a dried fruit mix thing that I got from Tesco's that I mix into it, super, super tasty. And I put a bit of vanilla in there as well for a bit of extra flavour. So it's high carb. We're looking at roughly a gram per kilo of body weight. So for me, that was 83 grams of carbohydrates in that breakfast. And then you're going to know from your own experience, and this is why a training diary is super important, you're going to know how long to leave it between eating and exercising. Like me, I can leave it an hour. I know people who can leave it 20 minutes. I know people who need to leave it 3 hours. You need to practice this, and you need to see what works for you. And you'll know you'll get it wrong if you start your run and you feel like you want to be sick or you want to go the other end. And you'll know if you get it wrong if you start the run and you're super hungry. Because the thing about a high carb meal is it's going to pass through the digestive system pretty quick. It's going to empty the stomach pretty quick, and that's going to make you hungry. But as soon as you've got into the exercise that you're doing, the ride or the hike or the run, that hunger signal is going to be dulled a lot more because you're doing activity. The body's already busy. If you have a bowl of porridge in the morning and sit do nothing for 3 hours, you're going to be hungry because it's passed through the stomach quickly. So on that morning, we want roughly a gram per kilo body weight of carbohydrates and minimum about a litre of water. So my race started at 8 a.m. I was up at 5:30. I got up at 5:30 because A, I needed to charge my phone, B, I needed to download some YouTube videos I was going to listen to while I was running, and C, I needed to get a coffee. They were my 3 most important things. After that, I had breakfast at around 6. So I left it a few hours because I tend to go half breakfast, leave it a little while, have my coffee, go to the toilet, do what I need to do, and then have the rest of my breakfast. So I'm kind of eating it over a nice long period of time. I wanted to make sure I had tons of time to get to the start line, so I'm all set and ready. So it took me about an hour collectively to finish breakfast. And in that time, as soon as I got out of bed in the morning, I'm sipping a litre of water. I've got a 1 litre shaker, and I'm getting that downrange until it's finished. Having a pee immediately before the race starts, before I then approach the line, before they're called over on the tannoy, that's a perfect place to be because it means you are adequately hydrated. There are studies out there, and I haven't necessarily flashed up any studies on the screen, or I could share them in the podcast notes, but if you've got questions on this or you want to see the studies, just ping me a DM, probably on Instagram or on Facebook or something like that, and just let me know if you want to see them and I can share them with you because I've got a repertoire of them all on my computer. But there is a study that shows that a hydration level of just 2% can have a reduction in performance of around 20%. That's largely subjective to the group that have been studied. There's a lot of nuance in it, but if we take it on face value, 2% reduction in hydration, so a dehydration level of 2%, which is a tiny, tiny, tiny amount, has a drop in performance for this particular group of people by 20%. Now, if we look at that and then assume that that applies to us, that's a big reduction in performance in whatever our long training session is. So hydration, super important. So getting that hydration in first thing on the morning of the race, super, super important. There's a lot more we can go into, and I'm going to do a separate podcast on sweat levels and hydration and electrolytes and all the rest of it, because I think that's going to be an interesting topic on its own, and there's a few graphics that I want to use for that as well. But ultimately, carbohydrate loading, 8 to 10 grams per kilo body weight of carbohydrates from Wednesday to Friday, the 3 days before your race, if Saturday is the race. Reduction of fiber from that Wednesday as well, so slowly but surely reduce it down so that Friday, your last meal, is just a normal size meal with an additional portion of carbohydrates. and you're not having a massive meal. Another tip for that Friday night is try and have an earlier dinner if you can, so that you can ensure you're actually going to the toilet properly in the morning of the race. Of the morning of the race, you're tried, you're tested, you're roughly 1 gram per kilo body weight of carbohydrate breakfast with a litre of fluid to go down where as well. You can use electrolytes or you can use water. If it's going to be a particularly hot run or race or whatever, then electrolytes are going to better suit you. Otherwise, just water, depending on what you can stomach. Me, personally, I love the taste of like crisp, cold water first thing in the morning. There's something very satisfying about that, especially as I was about to go into 9 hours of just drinking electrolytes and carbohydrate mix. And then we go into the race itself. So let's talk about this. Now, if we look at the science and the research behind carbohydrates and fueling of workouts for the optimal level, we're looking at between 60 and 90 grams of carbohydrates per hour. The reason it's 60 to 90 is the absorption levels of glucose. Now, we can absorb and utilize roughly 60 grams per hour of glucose. We can increase that to 90 grams if we mix that glucose with fructose, or we use things like maltodextrin, which are in your kind of more cheaper gels, more mass-produced gels use maltodextrin. Essentially, it's cheaper. It does work really well as a super simple carbohydrate. It's more synthesized than, say, rice syrup or other sources of sugar that other companies will tend to use. I've got resources on maltodextrin. I've written blog posts on maltodextrin. We can go into depths of that at a later date. If you want to know more, ping me a message and I'll send you the blog post. If not, go onto my website and search the blog. And that will give you a bit more of a detail on maltodextrin. That is your choice. But if we're looking at this 60 to 90 grams of carbohydrates from whole foods is a lot of carbohydrates. That's roughly an entire saurine loaf every hour, and not even I could eat that. So we need to look to other products that are going to help us, more concentrated levels of sugar. Yes, you can use sports nutrition brands, or you could use pick and mix. There are loads of different things that we can use here to better fuel ourselves throughout our long sessions. For me personally, on the Ultra Trail Snowdonia 50 last weekend, I used Voom products throughout. Very seldom would I use one specific type of product for an entire race. But I did for this one, A, as a training exercise, and B, because I know what that food does in my body, and I hadn't had the best training leading up to the race, so therefore I hadn't had a lot of practice with other food sources. I know I can eat saurine, I know I can eat stroopwafels, I know I can eat fruit, I know I can eat nuts and all the rest of it. A, I didn't really have that much time to prepare. B, wasn't the best training for me leading up to it. And C, this was a lot easier. And it paid off because it was brilliant. And I felt, apart from the limit of my fitness, energy-wise, it felt fantastic. Didn't bonk once. Still to this day, touch wood, haven't hit the wall. I feel like there are ways past that. And I gave it my absolute all on Saturday. I crossed the line with nothing left in the tank. Nothing at all. Now, what worked for me was using the bars, the Voom bars, which are great, roughly 40 to 50, I think they're 46 grams per bar in pretty much all of them. So I had 2 of every flavor, there was 8 in total. I also had their Fusion Fuel, which I'm going to throw it out there again, not sponsored, not an ad. I think their Fusion Fuel is utterly game-changing. It's brilliant. I've had a lot of different companies worth of sort of liquid carbohydrates. Some of them are just, they make the water so thick that I hate drinking it. And if you hate drinking it, you're not going to drink it. And if you don't drink it, you're not fueling, you're not hydrating, you're not getting electrolytes. One-way ticket to disaster. So if you don't like it, you need to change that strategy. And the Fusion Fuel, I think, is brilliant. And it works so well for me because it keeps the liquid thin. You know how if you're drinking water, it's quite a thin liquid. If you have like a really thick, viscous liquid from lots of sugar solution in it, it's quite hard to swallow. Fusion Fuel is on the opposite end of that spectrum. It's really, really good. So I had the apple and blackcurrant flavor. Amazing. I had 2 500 mils of that, and I did double sachets. So that was 180 grams of carbohydrates per squeezy. Then I had the 8 bars as well, and because the bars are broken into 4 chunks, I sliced the packet down the middle so that you don't get any offcuts of plastic. There's a real top tip there, folks. I don't like taking them out of the plastic wrapper because, especially bars, they'll just melt, especially in the heat. But if you slice it all the way down the middle, then you don't get that really annoying tag that just comes off, which 9 times out of 10 with a lot of people, unfortunately, ends up being left on the trail. It's quite hard to get into your pocket. So if you slice the pack already, you can just break it off and eat the chunks as and when. And I aim to have roughly half a bar every 20 or so minutes. my golden rule, which has worked every single time for me, write this down, is 40 to 60 grams of carbohydrates every 40 to 60 minutes. If you go on the upper end of the spectrum of this and you're doing 60 grams every 40 minutes, over your run, you're averaging out 90 grams per hour. If your digestive system just can't handle 90 grams per hour and you're getting 40 grams every 40 minutes, then you're at roughly 60 grams per hour, which is on the lower end of the spectrum, but still within that sort of optimal range, 60 to 90 grams per hour. So no matter how you look at it, you're doing a really, really good job and you're getting enough carbohydrates in. And just allowing for a little bit of flexibility in both time and concentration of sugar means that you're giving your digestive system a bit of a chance to stick with it. So the way I worked it out is I had 8 bars, I had 2 double pouches of the fusion fuel, I had 2 500 mils of the hydration as well, but I triple concentrated that, which was quite strong and very, very yellow. I had very sort of radioactive saliva and radioactive pee then, after as well. But that worked really, really well because it tasted great. And then all I used the feed stations for was 1 cup of Coke randomly. I was kind of hoping it was flat. Flat Coke is incredible. It wasn't. It was fizzy and I couldn't really stomach it. And then around 6 cups of water throughout the entire race itself. Outside of that, 4 stroop waffles, 1 piece of watermelon and 2 segments of orange. And that was it from the feed stations. If you want a top tip from me here, folks, don't base your race off what you think is going to be in the feed stations. Use the feed stations to supplement what you have tried, what you have tested, and what you trust. I know that stroop waffles are amazing. They taste great. Watermelon, bomb-proof. Orange segments, just fresh and cold and delicious, and I just needed some at that point. Collectively, all of that together, if I added it all up, averaged at around 340 calories per hour, which when we look at sort of longer distance and lesser intensity endurance activities, we're looking at calories per hour rather than grams of carbohydrates. That is indeed a podcast of its own because we're kind of going outside the realm of sort of relatively intense running. But it also averaged out at around 84 grams of carbohydrate per hour, and I felt brilliant. My legs wanted to die because I basically reached the limit of my fitness on some of those hills. At the end of the day, that's your after action review. You finish your event, you get the diary out. What went well? What didn't go well? What have I learned? And you go through those 3 areas so that next time and the next training session for the next day, you are back in the room, you know, you have learnt, you have grown, and you can go forward from there. But nutrition-wise, we don't need to overcomplicate it. If you like other brands like Supernatural Fuel and they're sort of more of a whole foods approach in their sachets, go mad. Look at the numbers. Look at the grams of carbohydrate. Aim for 40 to 60 grams every 40 to 60 minutes. Hydration, obviously keep on top of hydration. I refilled those squeezies, those 500 ml squeezies twice each, and I actually necked one of just cold water. So I think I had in the end 7.5 litres of fluid over the entire race, including the cups and stuff, because I had all of those. They were refilled. They were refilled twice. One was necked in total, and then around 6 cups of the water. Yeah, came at around 7 to 7.5 litres of fluid throughout the entire race. So I maintained a decent amount of hydration. I was still in a dehydrated state when I finished, but that comes back to the end of the race nutrition. So a lot of information in this podcast. I appreciate that. But let's just, if you need to, rewind, go back through it. I'm trying to make this as systematic as possible, but also as short as possible. Brevity is not my strong point, but I don't want this to be hours and hours and hours long. I want this to be a max of 30 minutes. After your event or your training session, that's when we need to look at protein. It's hard. It's so hard to stomach food after you've pushed so hard. So I had salty crisps and water. I needed that. Sugar, you need it. You're going to be hypoglycemic, low blood sugar. Get that back in. And at some point between 0 minutes and 3 hours, you need to have between 30 and 40 grams of protein. I don't care if that comes from a pizza, like it did from me, and a pack of chicken that I scoffed when I hit the fridge when I got home, or from a recovery shake. The Voom recovery shakes taste incredible. I couldn't stomach something like that until I got home, and it was 3 or 4 hours after the race, but I'd already eaten some chicken, I'd already had a recovery fudge bar, I'd already had a pizza, and I'd already had a piece of cake. Like necessary carbohydrates, necessary calories, necessary salts, necessary fluids. to a point where I could then start getting more protein on. And that's largely it when it comes to dialing in nutrition for race day. Let's not overcomplicate it. Simple carbs for the 3 days beforehand. Up it by 8 to 10 grams per kilo body weight for those 3 days. 3 litres of water per day. Make one of those litres electrolytes. Keep the meals relatively small. Just add an additional carbohydrate portion per meal. Friday night, don't have a massive meal. Saturday morning, 1 gram per kilo body weight of carbohydrates with 1 litre of fluid before you start your race. Throughout the race, 40 to 60 grams of carbohydrate every 40 to 60 minutes. Post-exercise, on top of hydration, of course. We'll go into hydration levels in a separate podcast episode because there's a lot we can dive into there. And then we are looking at post-exercise, carbs, sugar, salt, and protein when you can stomach protein. So my preference post-exercise, especially with a big, long, intense race, is go whole foods like pizza and then go for your recovery shakes. But let me know how you get on. Trial, test, use your long training sessions to learn what works for you. Take these principles, make your own methods, and get after it.